Good morning and welcome to the viewing and listening audience to the first virtual hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration. This is the committee's first hearing with stakeholders pursuant to its inquiry into the effects of the hybrid learning system on student performance in government and government-assisted schools during the revised COVID-19 restrictions. We'd like to remind participants that this is a virtual meeting and certain specific guidelines will apply, including making sure you mute your microphone when you're not speaking to help keep background noise and distractions to a minimum. We also advise you to try and focus on the microphone situation, because in the past, sometimes it's very easy to lose track that your mic is on or off, and when you're making a contribution, sometimes we can't hear you because you inadvertently left your mic off or left your mic on. We'd like you to adjust your camera so that your face is clearly visible at all times, and ensure that notifications from your cell phone or any other electronic device in your vicinity are muted during the course of this meeting. Sometimes they cause distractions. We have four groups before us today. I'm the committee's chairman, Paul Richards, and the groups before us include the Ministry of Education representatives, representatives of the Trinidad Tobago Unified Teachers Association, TUTA, the Association of Principals of Public Secondary Schools of Trinidad Tobago, and the National Primary Schools Principals Association. At this time, I'd like to invite members of our committee to introduce themselves, starting with Member Ford.
It's pleasant good morning to each and everyone. Esmond Ford, member of the committee.
Member Monroe.
Pleasant good morning, everyone. Roger Monroe, member of the committee.
Member Indassing.
Good morning, all. Rudranat Indassing, member of the committee, and looking forward to a very interactive session here this morning.
Member Singh.
Good morning, members of the committee. I am Avinash Singh, member of this committee.
I'm Member Naked.
Good morning to all watching, including the stakeholders, and looking forward also to a very, very productive session today.
I'd like to offer excuses for two members of the committee who are currently engaged in cabinet activities, including Ruby Beckles and also Mr. Rohan Sinanan. So those two are also members of the committee, but are currently engaged in cabinet activities. So thank you all for joining us, and we want to welcome, of course, once again, our viewing and listening audience. At this time, I'd like to identify the four objectives of this inquiry, and they are: one, to assess the effectiveness of the hybrid learning system used by government and government-assisted schools in curriculum delivery. Two, to compare and contrast student performance using traditional versus hybrid learning systems for a similar time periods we would have had the last 9 or so months in terms of the introduction of digital and online learning systems in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Three, to examine the systems and methods used to monitor and evaluate student performance in the hybrid learning environment. And four, to assess the readiness of the hybrid learning system to adequately prepare students for external examinations. We have some examinations coming up, including CAPE and CSEC and SCA once again in the not too distant future. At this time, I'd like to also invite representatives of the various groups before us to introduce themselves briefly, starting with the officials of the Ministry of Education.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Lisa Henry David, Acting Chief Education Officer, Ministry of Education. And with me, I have Mrs. Anna Singh, Director, Curriculum Planning and Development Division, and Mrs. Kamini Bagalu, Assistant Director, Research and Evaluation.
Thank you. Could Mrs. Tika De Freitas introduce herself and her team, please, from TUTA?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to members of the committee. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. I am Antonia Tika De Freitas, President of TUTA, With me this morning, we have our Tobago officer, Mr. Braden Roberts, and our Education and Research officer, Mrs. Lisa Ibrahim Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you. And from the Association of Principals of Public Secondary Schools of Trinidad and Tobago, can Mrs. Carrington James introduce herself and her team, please?
Good morning to you all, Trinidad and Tobago and the listening public. I am indeed Shara Carrington James. I am president of the Association of Principals of Public Secondary Schools, Trinidad and Tobago. This morning, I would have joining me the secretary of our association, APS, Patricia Pitt.
And last but by no means least, the officials of the National Primary Schools Principals Association. And Mr. Motley, please introduce yourself and your team.
Yes, good morning to you, Mr. Chairman, and to all members present. Good morning to the listening and viewing public. My name is Lance Motley, the president of the National Primary School Principals Association, and with me is the first vice president, Mrs. Paula Killigman.
Thank you all for being with us. We appreciate your time this morning. Just to give us some context to start, I'd like to give some information, some data on a submission from the Education Ministry dated December 15th. And it was in response to a request for written submission on the inquiry into the effects of the hybrid learning system on student performance in government and government-assisted schools during the revised COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, And we also received, which I'd like to acknowledge, submissions from the stakeholders who are with us today, in addition to 3 private citizens, Abba Luke, who's a parent, Avion McLish, who's a parent, and also Sparkle Martin, who's a parent. And their contributions are paraphrased and read into the record during the course of this interface, because I think it's important also to hear from citizens about their experiences, which have been good and bad, and we'll share this with you as the session progresses. So one of the highlighted bits of information I'd like to start with is from the Education Ministry, and to a question, what has been the feedback obtained so far regarding teaching and learning systems categorized in relation to the perspectives of teachers, students, and parents? The question went on to ask, please include major challenges identified in relation to the following. From the perspective of teachers, what the response was: there's mixed feedback from parents and students depending on the learning environment in the home and other variables. In addition to the learning environment at home, prior knowledge and language capability and rate of learning will affect how students grasp lessons and assimilate content, whether through remote learning or face-to-face lessons. Most teachers reported they have reliable internet connections, 81.5% secondary, 71.9% primary. Devices, in terms of teachers, 82.8% secondary and 76.8% primary. And they were satisfied with the software they were using in terms of 68.2% primary and 73.2% secondary. However, sustainability, less teachers agreed that their students had reliable internet service, 34.1% primary and 35.3% secondary. Commented on whether the students had reliable internet access to devices, 33.4% primary and 35.3% secondary. And importantly also, because learning environment is important, had a peaceful environment for remote learning, 29.9% primary and 29.2% secondary. One of the challenges, of course, facing not only teachers, but everyone who has to work from home or work or hybrid in that system was work-life balance. Which was one of the challenges facing teachers. Only 35.4% of primary and 41.2% of secondary teachers agreed they were able to maintain a healthy work-life balance. To what extent are students grasping lessons and assimilating content? And it was on a scale of, a Likert scale of 1 being not effective and 5 being very effective. On average, primary teachers gave a rating of 2.9 out of 5, where secondary school teachers gave a rating of 3.14 out of 5 in terms of how they thought students were grasping and assimilating content on a 19% of primary school students, which translates into 1 in 5 students, disagree that their internet access at home was good enough for remote learning. 15% of primary school students disagree that they have access to an electronic device for their remote learning. And not only do we see that some students have issues with technology, but also their learning environment. 22% of primary school students disagree they have a quiet area to study. That's almost a quarter. And 17.2% of primary school students, as well as 27.1% of secondary school students, disagree they do not do interesting activities during remote learning. Students also reported socio-emotional challenges with remote learning. 51.9%, or a little over half, of primary school students and 52.1% of secondary school students agree it is difficult to stay focused during their remote learning. And 65.6% of secondary school students agree they were feeling more stressed than usual. And finally, when asked to rate the effectiveness of remote learning compared to traditional learning on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not effective and 5 being effective, the parents of students rated the average effectiveness score at 3.21. Parents felt confident in their ability to support their child academically, with 80.1% of students agreeing they are assured they can assist their children in their schoolwork or lessons. The challenges in terms of technology and environment, 74% of parents agree their internet access at home is good enough for remote learning. 64% of parents believe they have sufficient devices to support their child in remote learning, and 72.3% of parents agreed they have appropriate areas for their children to study in their houses. The main challenge parents faced is having to simultaneously manage their children's affairs in addition to their own. 63.1% of parents agree it is difficult for them to balance their own work and their child's learning, and 50% of parents agree that it's difficult to focus on their child's learning when they also have to focus on other needs. And 48.9% of parents agree that it's difficult to keep a study schedule for their child. So that's just some context for us regarding the Ministry of Education submission. I also like to add that we have some data from the ministries which focused on how many students at each school level are currently unable to access the various online learning platforms. ECCE, approximately 2,195. The primary level, a total of 39,861 students are currently unable to access various online learning platforms. At the secondary school level, 6,909 students. And the data on the estimated number of primary and the secondary school students who have never logged on to the portals, according to the data supplied by the Education Ministry, includes 39,861 at the secondary level. That's the primary level. The secondary level, 6,909. And there are also significant challenges in terms of children with special needs being able to access online learning. And I provided that information so that we could get some context and comparisons based on the various stakeholder groups here in terms of if your experiences and data lines up or aligns with that data supplied by the Education Ministry. Because as we said, this is about finding out about the effects of this system, this hybrid system and online system of students' performance of government and government-assisted schools. So we can open the questioning with questions directed at the Education Ministry. Your submissions indicated that due to the prohibitive cost, the ministry has not acquired software used to monitor test taking. However, the Education Ministry is focusing on alternative methods of assessment and yet maintaining the quality of education for students. Please elaborate on the alternative means of assessments referred to and how these alternative means of assessment maintain the quality of education and, by extension, assessment for students. So that question to the Education Ministry.
Curriculum Planning and Development. Take that question.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The concern with respect to test taking using virtual modality would be the requirements to ensure validity and reliability in terms of whether students have access to extra materials, prompts, and so on. what has been happening in the school system at this time would be we are using a combination of submissions with respect to via emails. We even have submissions via WhatsApp, and we have submissions in hard print that is delivered to the school. And we are using as well, in terms of the online engagement, checklists, the engagement of students as teachers do call out using the chats and so on. It is a very limited situation, realizing that our experience in what is not really a hybrid system, but our attempt to facilitate remote learning, online instruction in the height of COVID has have us attempting more preliminary and simple approaches, because to transition to anything sophisticated, we did not have the time to train, to expose our teachers. So at this point in time, those are the methodologies being used, and they vary by year level.
Thank you. I'd like to hear the tutor's response and also the principals of public secondary schools, because they would have had direct interface with the students, and also the National Primary Schools Principals Association and their experience where the assessment systems that have been put in this situation, because it is an emergency transition system. It's not by any means what anybody would want. We had to respond as a country and as a state to the pandemic and the restrictions that were enacted to save lives and protect people. But certainly, I think 9 months in, we should be at some level assessing where we are, which is what we're trying to do here, and growing from the experience. So if Ms. Tika de Freitas could comment on what the teachers are saying regarding the assessment system, and certainly the principals of public secondary schools, and then the Principals Association, Primary Principal Association. So Mrs. de Freitas, you first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am glad that the representative from the Ministry of Education made a distinction that we are still working in the context of remote learning as opposed to hybrid learning, because that definitely identifies some of the challenges and constraints in terms of student assessment and assessment of performance. With your permission, Mr. Chair, I would like to ask our Education and Research Officer, Ms. Lisa Ibrahim Joseph, to elaborate on the figures, the data which we have collected from our members as far as student performance and assessment goes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I hand over to Ms. Ibrahim Joseph.
Mr. Chairman, good morning to the members of the committee. Good morning to our listening and viewing public. So, Mr. Chairman, we surveyed around 2,315 of our members, and in our inquiry into the kinds of assessment strategies that are used, our responses identified a range of strategies. The respondents are over 1,700, so we're still tabulating and extrapolating the data by levels. What I can share with you, though, is that the vast majority of those engaged in online teaching and learning in the virtual classrooms used a combination of quizzes and projects using the platforms that were available to them, so that many of the teachers used other platforms beside that of the ministry. They engage platforms like Zoom, Google Classroom, MS Teams. Where they use Google Classroom, they would have administered their quizzes via things like Google Forms. A number of them also indicated the use of game-based learning applications such as Kahoots in order to assess students. The issue raised by the representative from the Ministry of Education surrounding reliability and validity of the assessment is one noted by the association as well, because we note that in the absence of a formal system that exercises controls over the ways in which these assessment strategies are administered, it is really very difficult to ascertain whether it would in fact yield reliable information on student performance.
I'm glad you raised that point, and I'm going to add this to the question moving on to Mrs. Shira Carrington-James of the Association of Principals of Public Secondary Schools, and also pitching it back to the Education Ministry as we traverse these 9 months into the future, and how if we are moving to standardize the assessment, given the range of assessment modalities as articulated by the ministry. And I understand that anyone with any reasonableness would understand that, well, when this started, emergency situations would have had to be implemented because it's a pandemic. But certainly 9 months in, has there been any standardization of the assessment modes across forms, across schools? Because if X school is assessing based on one modality and Y school is assessing based on one modality, how are we standardizing those results on a national level? And I will go to Mrs. Carrington-James and then Mr. Motley, and then back to the Education Ministry, and then we'll open the floor to members of the committee to peruse this topic even more. So, Mrs. Carrington-James, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Richards, Senator Richards. The Secondary School Association, I want to put this up front, does not have the resources to do the kinds of research. Tutor mentioned 1,700 responses. So we don't have the resources to do that kind of in-depth analysis. And therefore, I hesitate to give figures because whatever I am going to contribute this morning to add clarity would be anecdotal. So I want to put that up front. Even in the time frame in which we were invited to be part of this particular stakeholder initiative and to give clarity from that perspective, we would not have had time. So this is an attempt to cover the entire gamut of the country in a very purposive way, whoever was available, and that is the feedback that I'm given. So in the context of assessment, we have tried across our fraternity to ensure that we stick to one particular platform in any particular school, maybe a variant of two, but certainly the standardization within that school, which happens if even we're in the building. There's no standardized practice of how we do assessment in building either, in brick and mortar. So when we come here to the platform, it would only be accentuated. What we did as an association in our fraternity, most of us would have tried to ensure that if we're using Zoom and Google Classroom, that across the board in that school, that is what obtained. I would suggest, though, that to mitigate some of the variabilities across schools, if we stuck to what we intended to, which is to standardize our rubrics for assessment, which especially in the upper school is dictated by the CXC syllabus, and we stick to content analysis, then the variability across platforms is not impactful. So if I'm looking at the content, whether the child is giving me a video or the child is giving me a poem and I'm looking for the content in there, I can still reliably assess that. And that is the key that we emphasize across our fraternity. We also use the time as a resource to ensure that given the online modality, it was the child's authentic work, whatever it was. So if we restricted time, synchronous assessments, then the parent would not have had the time to look over the shoulder and maybe give input. And so we use time as a restrictive factor to ensure that there was some element of authentic response coming from the student. We did see it coming out sometimes in the language department, the Google Translate and so on, and the teachers would see that. The cost of having software, as the ministry said, to monitor students, like Exemplify, some of these things are very, very costly. And therefore, we would have invested our time in terms of character development and moral suasion and interacting with our parents to understand that, look, you're not helping the child. If he or she is able to give us good, bad, or in between, a response that is authentically his or her, we can then develop, grow, and move with that. We can work with the child then. So in a nutshell, for us, it was a standardization within schools, limiting the platform, restricting time, synchronous assessments, and this term it helped because the ministry would have prescribed that we do formative assessments. So those little nuggets as well allowed us to assess whether children were indeed engaging, whether they were learning, whether the feedback was indeed positive, and whether the teachers could then move on. So I would leave that there for now.
Thank you. Let's go to Mr. Motley.
Yes, hi, good morning once again, and thank you for the opportunity. So just to take off on the last speaker, it's a little bit more challenging in the primary school for us to do the kind of assessment that is required, especially within the given context. As a matter of fact, we employed a wide range of strategies that would incorporate both online and both paper-based packages. As you would have indicated in your preamble, some 39,000, that's close to 40,000 of our students would not have been able to have access to online services, connectivity. So they would have had to use the packages format. And as you would perhaps know, that is very difficult to teach at the primary level, to teach concepts and to engage our students using packages. And it's also challenging as well in the virtual environment, because you have prompts, you have the parents who might be prompting the children, and so reliability and validity of the tests would be compromised. So we did, of course, use the formative assessment mode, but even within that, reliability and validity of assessments would have been compromised. But nonetheless, at the primary level, the focus really is about getting especially at this time, getting our children or students involved to participate. And that too is very challenging at the primary level. Remember, our primary school students are not as independent a learner as it is perhaps maybe in the other levels. So you really want to get the children to participate. And so exam conditions will not apply. The time would not apply strictly. So that giving students time to do a test and so on, that would have been reduced somewhat, again, to allow the students to be able to participate.
All right, just respond to the Education Ministry and I'll open the floor to members of the committee to ask questions on the particular issue. So Education Ministry, could you respond to the standardization if we had moved in that direction? And as I said before, and I want to make it very clear, this is not about assigning blame as opposed to finding information that can help improve the situation regarding our young learners. The country, like every other country, has had to respond under pandemic conditions. Not in my lifetime I ever had to go through this. So I think credit has to be given for what has been done so far, but certainly finding out what has been done and where the gaps lie it will contribute greatly to improving the situation moving forward, because we don't know how long we'll be under these conditions moving forward. So can the Education Ministry officials please give us a sense of how the grades that have been gleaned, I guess, after the lockdown in March of last year into the reopening of the online learning system and compared to previously, and what factoring did happen in terms of the non-standardized assessment versus the standardized assessment, and what the data presented in that regard.
To provide some context, we need to also understand the role of standardized assessments in the Ministry of Education. Our standardized assessments are really restricted to those for certification and placements. So those are the SCA, the CSEC, the CAPE exam, and then we have those for national school monitoring, the national test, which we haven't had in place for a couple of years because we are revamping that. The NCSE, which is the one that is done at the end of Form 3, those are for monitoring purposes, as well as to get a gauge, an interim gauge of how students are progressing. So those are the rules for standardized tests. As the other speakers would have indicated, the ministry has focused on continuous assessment and looking at continuous assessment in terms of the development of the students, deriving data and feedback to drive learning and to drive instruction. And therefore, with regard to the pandemic, guidelines were provided to assist in terms of identifying content to be focused on and to give us suggested assessments that can be done using the online modality using the options of print and emails wherever possible. I would want to say that the focus of such assessments would tend to therefore lay more on the higher order thinking skills, the applications, as opposed to the lower order skills. So that's why projects and opportunities for assessing critical thinking were more what we wanted to emphasize. And that would sort of mitigate against the concerns of, for instance, cheating and so on, where you're just looking at recall. None of it is, as I said, imperfection. All of this is really a hastening of the agenda of the ministry in terms of what we already had in train and what we had to attempt to emphasize and prioritize in a shorter time frame. These standardized tests that were conducted were the SCA in 2020, were the CSEC and the CAPE exams, and those were conducted on a face-to-face modality using the pencil and paper assessment, and those were managed by CXC in terms of the correction and the producing of the results. That did not change from prior, and so we did not go hybrid or online in terms of the standardized assessments. I hope that helps provide some.
Thank you very much. Did you see a significant change in the performance of students between the terms subsequent to the restrictions and the move to online? Primary and secondary. In terms of
the standardized assessment?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So we, for the SCA, we noted small changes in terms of really relating to the fact that the children were expecting to do an assessment in April, and they now had to do an assessment in August, and within that time frame, there was a lot of uncertainty as to when they would be attempted face-to-face. Because of issues of COVID, we had to revert back to online. So that bit of trauma, we would want to factor in as one of the considerations. The paper in itself, we cannot assess in terms of how students did, but in terms of the result. We'll have the director of education research just chime in a little in terms of the results.
So what we would have noticed coming out of the SCA examination is that the mean score for mathematics, there was a small reduction by about 2%. However, with the English language arts, there was a major improvement by about 9% improvement from 2019 to 2020. The reduction in mathematics, however, it is something that we can compare worldwide, where we have seen that mathematics is such a subject where the students need to be doing mathematics regularly and practicing mathematics. And this may have been one of the reasons why we saw a little reduction in terms of the performance for mathematics.
And as your colleague also said, we have to factor the disruption. Member Anderson, go ahead, please.
Chairman, I've heard about from the, yes, and good morning again to all. And I've heard from officials of the Ministry of Education speaking about the cost of software as it relates, if I could, to recollect correctly, in terms of what is needed in relation to the continuous assessment of students. The ministry has to purchase what, or acquire what is called software for what purpose?
I think it's for online assessment.
Assessment, right. And one of them indicated that it was very costly. Could we be told of the cost that is needed? Because we see that expenditure is taking place all over. And I would hate to think that the Ministry of Education is not pushing to get the necessary finances through cabinet approval for the acquisition of this specific software that is needed.
Mrs. Henry David, you can go ahead, please. Okay, and if you can give us the cost of this, the average cost of the software.
Sorry, I am unable to provide that type of information at this time. However, the ministry at this time is focusing on acquiring devices for our children so that they can actually attend the classes before we look at software for assessment. So, for example, we have an MOU with the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and we have taken...
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up on this, sir.
Yes, no problem. Go ahead, Mrs. Henry David.
Yes, so we have taken delivery of 800 and another 500 devices. Yesterday, we had a tender committee met to look at tenders for another 350 devices. We have been, we are grateful to our corporate citizens for providing a number of our students with devices so that they can indeed attend these online classes. But as the chairman would have indicated at the beginning, we have quite a number of students who have not been able to access online classes. And therefore, as we go forward, our first line is to provide our students with the devices and the connectivity that they need in order to access classes. Because as all the speakers before would have indicated, the package system is not ideal. We do not know how long we will be in this mode for. It is the current reality. And while, yes, the assessment software is something that we like to look at for the future, we have more immediate needs, which we are striving to satisfy at this point. What
is the criterion for distributing devices as the ministry acquires them?
Okay, so in the first instance, our devices we are giving to students in examination classes. So that would be Standard 5 and Forms 5 and 6. In addition, we have a means test that has been developed, which we will be administering when we acquire other devices from other sources. So, for example, the TAT devices, they are 10,000, and we have just over 9,000 students of Standard 5, and Forms 5 and 6 who are without devices. So we are looking at catering to those students in the first instance. They are not going to be subject to a means test. But in terms of the devices that the ministry is to acquire, and as you know, worldwide, there is a run on devices. So it's not as easy to get them in at the time that you would like to. So we have been subject to 500 by 400 and so as we go forward. As we get those devices, we will be administering a means test. And the means test would look at, well, we would have sent to the committee the means test, but we're looking at getting the information on the children, the financial information of the caregiver, and the number of persons living in the household, and we're looking at whether the household is already in receipt of government grants, and the number of devices and that sort of thing, and we'll be able to administer this means test as we go forward. But as I said, in the first instance, we're looking at exam classes.
Mr. Anderson, member asking you for a follow-up question.
Yes, Chairman, we have been told, and we continue to hear, and while I am listening to the acting chief education officer here this morning, we have been told, and when I say the country has been told that we are about to return or should be returning to what is called a hybrid environment where there will be face-to-face teaching, and I stand to be corrected, by the 8th of February by the Minister of Education. But I find it a bit, and I want to be very circumspect in what I'm saying here this morning, because we are being told about the emphasis on devices, and we are being told now that the mode or the software for the continuous assessment or online assessment is being placed on the back burner. We are into virtually a year into the pandemic, and I find it highly, highly unreasonable that we cannot hear this morning what is the sum of money that is needed through the Ministry of Education to acquire this particular
I'm going to ask the education officials to provide that in writing. Is there any other question you have on the issue?
Yes, and I also would like this means test, because we have heard from the Minister of Education about adopting a school. And up till now, the country seems to be in limbo as it relates to how many devices have been donated, given, granted, or gifted to the Ministry of Education.
Member Ndassing, if you have a question for information that you'd like the education officials to provide, please do that. But the pontification about executive decisions is not what this inquiry is about.
Yes, Chairman, but I like to put it in the context.
And that's great. But we have a particular objective. We have objectives with this inquiry, and these officials are not here to answer those questions.
Well, I would like to know the number of devices that have been acquired by the Ministry of Education under the Adopt a School program, and a total breakdown of how these devices have been distributed so far across the secondary and primary schools of the country, what we are in terms of what is the shortfall, how much money is needed to meet the shortfall. And in addition to that, I would like this means test that the officials are referring to be properly communicated with the wider citizenry of this country, if it means publication in all the newspapers and so on, so in relation to educating parents who may be in need of devices on behalf of their children.
All right, thank you. So education officials, you heard the request from Member Ndassing in terms of the breakdown of outstanding devices, what have been distributed, and the shortfall. Any other members have?
Mr. Chairman, for there, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes. Again, welcome again to all the participants in this important JSC. What I would like to find out, Mr. Chairman, is that the Ministry of Education officials have been speaking about the assessment that have been made with regards to the first set of exams that we would have done during the COVID period, which would have been CAPE, SCA, and CSEC, right? But again, remember, most of those students would have already been trained to physical classes prior to the March 2020 shutdown as a result of the restrictions that would have been brought in by the Ministry of Health, right? So again, I am thinking that we may not be in a position to give a true assessment to say what the online classes have been able to effect with regards to our students. So again, in light of that, right, my important question is to convey, I know we have been hearing the numbers with regards to the number of primary school students, secondary school students, early childhood students that have not been able to access some of the online classes. But in relation to the presentation submitted by the Ministry of Education, the submission indicated that the Ministry of Education has collaborated with the media, Trinidad Guardian, 91.1 Talk City, and TTT to create and distribute broadcast educational content for students. This is on pages 9 and 10 of the submission by the Ministry of Education. And in light of that, my question is, what method does the Ministry of Education use to assess the number of students reached and the level of student engagement and content distribution via those media channels? Because, Mr. Chairman, we are only hearing about the online, not enough devices, not enough tablets, not enough iPhones, but there's also a medium where we are using Guardian Media, we are using 91.1 Talk City and TTT. So could the ministry shed some light on that, please?
Yes, good morning, sir. The ministry currently gets anecdotal feedback from parents who would call into the early childhood division for further direction and to give their comments and so on. We at this time do not have an assessment of the numbers of persons so accessing the content via the newspapers, via the radio. But we also have, during this time, while those media are being used, the early childhood children, their parents can access the content on the ministry's website, on the SLMS and the EMIS, and those parents are in contact with their school teachers, the children who are enrolled in private early childhood centers. The teachers at those centers are in contact with the parents. And in terms of the numbers of persons accessing the newspapers and the radio content, I cannot give you a figure at this time. We will look into trying to see how we can quantify that.
Mr. Chairman, just a follow-up, and I'll go to the other question one time. And again, to the Ministry of Education officials. Again, we are now in January 2021, right? So roughly March will make it 1 year, right? So again, I know you all will have your schedules and your timelines, but again, we as parliamentarians and as also citizens, right? We would like to be sure that our students are in line to receive the education that they so need. So as a result of that, my follow-up question would be, again, in your submission, and I quote, class checks are conducted by heads of departments, senior teachers, vice principals, and principals to assess the competence of teachers to deliver the curriculum in the hybrid blended learning environment. And that submission is on page 12, right? And there, the question to be answered, what method is used again to conduct these class checks? Right, I know you spoke about the parents calling in and so on, or students, right? But you also mentioned that your staff would make these visits. So again, what method is used to conduct these class checks? And secondly, what method is used to ascertain the level of competence of teachers to deliver the curriculum using the online learning systems? Can you shed some light there, please?
Okay, so as with the normal face-to-face classrooms, there are officials within each school who are charged with the responsibility of ensuring that the teachers are carrying out their teaching and learning sessions up to standard. This is translated into the online environment so that the heads of division, the heads of department, and the deans, the senior teachers, and so on, those are the persons who are charged with that responsibility within the online environment. The ministry is currently collecting data on how that has taken place over the past term. I have before me an unfinished report, right, which collects data, for example, on how were class checks and clinical supervision conducted, and they are asking questions about whether they were random virtual class checks, pre-planned virtual class checks, or a combination, and we are even collecting data on whether or not, or on if it did in fact happen. So this, as I said, what I have before me is preliminary data, but at the national level, we had just about 50% of the secondary schools, I think it is, saying that they would have done random class checks. Another 31% indicating that they did pre-planned class checks. 14% indicating that they did a combination of both, and just under 4% indicating that they did not do any. So we are in the process of collecting that data. As I said, this is preliminary, and so we're not in a position to send it to you all as yet, but we recognize the need to ensure that our system, that we check our systems, and that we ensure that our standards are kept. And we at the core of the ministry are and have been taking steps to ensure that teaching and learning is done to certain standards and that the checks are carried out.
One last follow-up, Mr. Chairman. And again, I hear you, Madam CEO, but keep in mind with the international news, right? The UK, Canada, many countries are going on further shutdowns, right? Closing up their borders as the case may be. And we are saying, come February 8th, we want to have a pilot project where we would like some of our students to go out. The possibility exists between now and February date, that may not happen. So just in the event of it not happening, I think your ministry needs to sort of set some adequate timelines to ensure that, listen, these reports are completed so that the government of Trinidad and Tobago will have a good idea and a good picture as to where we stand and to know where we will go as we go further into 2021. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Motley, you had a comment. Mr. Motley?
Yes. Well, just to answer the question that raised by Member Ford about how teachers or schools monitor, we did of course some try to collect some data on how that is done, and the responses have been that routine class checks or sit-ins are done in the live online or live support chats for observation. How do we ensure that students are learning anything? Well, of course, we do oral questioning. We question our students. We look at the students' work, the work that they would have produced to determine if anything is being done at all. So we're looking at pupil performance data. We, of course, review teachers' assessments. This is from the principal side, by the way. Review teachers' assessment, planning, and written feedback to pupils. And these are just some of the methods that we have been adopting at the primary level to ensure the quality of education, notwithstanding the environment, is not the ideal one.
All right. I'm just going to ask two questions that we've received from the public.
Thanks for that information, Chair.
Sorry?
No, I just said thanks for that information.
Yes, thank you. We're going to pose two questions from the public and then move to, Member Monroe and his question. And the first question is, can the Ministry of Education indicate whether there is going to be any attempt to continue some aspects of extracurricular activity in schools? And also, why does the Ministry of Education propose not to use the mean test in distributing its current stock of donated devices? So I don't know if the ministry has answers for those. Reps has answers to those questions.
So I'll take the last question first. We, in terms of the agreement we have with TAT, we said we would start with children who are in need, and we felt that our examination students are most needy at this time. However, the means test will take a while in order to activate and to work and so to ensure that the children who are subject to it get a device. We took some time to develop the means test in the first place. So therefore, we couldn't wait until we had an active means test in order to start providing our children with the devices that they need in order to access teaching and learning. What was the first question? In terms of extracurricular activities, the Ministry of Health is who dictates, especially with the larger things like the team sports and so on. We bow to their superior knowledge on these issues.
For the guidelines on interaction and congregation, so we understand that.
This is where we are this time.
Mrs. De Freitas has a question, and we go to Member Monroe and his question. Mrs. De Freitas.
Mr. Chair, Tutor actually had two observations to make. One as far back as committee members endorsing contribution on the software and devices. So I don't know if you will permit that.
Yes, please go.
It had to do with the issue of supervision. So I will ask my colleague, Mr. Roberts, to speak to the issue of the devices and the software and what our experience and our reports have been, and then to Ms. Ibrahim Joseph for supervision.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for having me. In terms of the devices and the software, well, noting the response from the ministry, we would have realized that the ministry is trying to touch as many areas as possible. However, it needs to be more in-depth. So in terms of the curriculum guide that was also mentioned that went out, it needed of curriculum officers to then massage that guide with the teachers and not just send a guide, so that teachers would now have to pull out and see how best they could implement. We know that some curriculum officers would have made themselves available to assist teachers, but it would not have been in depth. So a lot of the areas would have just been touched. So we try to provide some laptops, so we cover some of that area. We try to provide some of the software. We mentioned that the software would have been costly. In terms of the AutoCAD, for example, for technical drawing, that is something critical. So it is not that we supply some things in some of the areas to just tick a box. It needed to be more in-depth so that we'll be able to be as effective as needed. We do understand that things are time-bound and we want to not leave any particular area lagging, but just touching the areas would not be sufficient.
Thank you. Mr. Member Monroe, you are next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all members of the panel, viewing and listening public. My question is a two-part question this morning, based on submission that indicates students' absence is a major issue in the online learning environment to the representative of the National Primary Schools and Principal Association. First part, what are some of the reasons given by parents or guardians for their children or charges being absent from online classes? And also, please provide recommendations for reducing students' absence in the online learning environment. Mr. Motley.
Mr. Motley?
Yes, Member Monroe. Well, I'm not too sure how widespread it is in terms of student absence. We do have, however, yes, I had indicated some time ago that there are some students who have not made themselves available at all at the primary level, but our research showed that it is a very small number. That's one. So there are some students who have not showed up at all. And then there are those who are absent, just as in the traditional classroom environment.
Well, that number, if I could interject, Mr. Motley, according to the data supplied by the Education Ministry, amounts to 39,861 students have never logged on.
Okay, so that could perhaps mean for students who do not have access to online. But remember, at the primary level, we engage our students both using those who are able to online and, of course, packages. As a matter of fact, quite a large number of our students or schools use the packages, which is another issue that we would have to address perhaps a little later on. So I am not too sure if that number reflects those students who have not accessed online or accessed education at all. But I am saying that there are some students, whether it be packages or whether it be online, perhaps it is a small number based on the information that we got, that who have not made themselves available at all, whether it be, again, packages or online. But we also have, in the general scheme of things, yes, we do have absenteeism, and the responses that we get, that is both online as well as packages, the responses we get from time to time is that parents, they have to work, they have no one to supervise their students, their children, they don't have the resources to ensure that their children do the work, whether it's packages or come online. And so those present some unique challenges during this particular context, this particular environment, which would exacerbate the absenteeism in our schools. He asked about what...
Put a pause there, Mr. Motley. Can I ask a question of the Education Ministry? Is there collaboration between yourselves and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services in terms of this kind of data that is being presented by the Education Ministry and the comment of Mr. Motley on providing some sort of assessment and support to those families who have these challenges?
At this time, we have referred a lot of those children to our Internal Student Support Services Division. And we, in our first meeting of this year, the minister, shone a spotlight on these children who are not being reached. And so it is, our intention to look more closely and see how we can collaborate with all and any stakeholders in order to ensure that these children are reached. The Ministry of Social Development, for example, was part of the team to develop the means test, and we would have also collaborated with them in terms of the provision of the food hampers, and we continue to work with them. But it is our intention to look more closely at those children who, for whatever reason, may not be accessing, whether it is the online education or the packages. And as I said, internally, we have referred them to our student support services, but we know that we have not thus far have been able to reach all of them, and we are going to go forward seeking to ensure all of our children.
While I take a point on that, comment, 9 months in, that's quite a large category of students who are falling behind. They're almost a year behind now. And many of those students and those families would have had challenges pre-COVID. Mr. Motley, you can continue.
Chairman, just before Mr. Motley continues, I heard again the Acting Chief Education Officer indicate that these students have been referred to the internal support systems within their respective schools, I would gather. Can you provide how many of these students, and in relation to give a breakdown in terms of the education districts?
Your mic is muted. Please unmute your mic. It's still unmuted, Mrs. Henry David. Thank you.
Sorry about that. We will be able to provide that information in writing.
Thank you. Mr. Motley?
Yes, thanks once again. Let me tell you, one of the realities that we have to face is that quite a number of households, families who, particularly in low socioeconomic environments, the focus is not really on education, especially at this time. This time is about ensuring their livelihoods, ensuring their households. And so they are going to take, if they have an option, the option would be to try to make $1 to feed their children rather than trying to ensure that their children are online. I mean, I've heard parents say to me that, listen, I need to go out there and feed my family. I do have the time to spend with my child. And that's a reality. And the COVID-19 experience would have exacerbated that. So we have to accept that. But let me also...
Actually, I disagree. We don't have to accept that. We have to acknowledge it and do something about it. And that's why I asked the question about the collaboration with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, because if we accept that, we'll be perpetuating a cycle of issues down the road.
Correct. You're right. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to do something about it. And we need to do something about it urgently, because as you have noted, and a few others have noted, that we are closing in to a year during this pandemic, and other measures should have been put in place to ensure that all of our families, or many of our families, are not fallen off the grid, so to speak. The recommendation, Member Monroe, and how to treat with it, we need to accelerate the plans by the Ministry of Education on the one hand to furnish every child with a device. We need to accelerate that plan, but not just a device, because we have people who don't have access to internet. So we need to ensure that the devices come with some level of internet connectivity. And I want to say that particularly in very rural communities, Southeastern District, and Northeastern area, in those very far removed communities where they are not served by any internet providers at all. We need to take that into consideration. So the Ministry of Education needs to be in collaboration with the service providers to determine those areas that are outside of the internet connectivity infrastructure reach, and to treat with that. But then that should have been done as well. I think a long time ago. I'm not too sure the ministry has that data.
If I could just interject here, we have a submission that the Education Ministry and the TAT and the TSTT have engaged in a collaboration to provide ICT-enabled devices and SIM cards with a 3-month internet package to selected students. To date, 800 devices have been delivered to schools for distribution to parents in these vulnerable areas. And I know a lot more needs to be done, but I just wanted to put that on the record in terms of what you're suggesting there. So there is something being done in that regard, but of course more needs to be done.
Yes, indeed. And the learning channel, I need to go there. There needs to be a better coordinated effort between the Ministry of Education and that channel and schools, so that parents and schools there will be a synergy between all of these entities, among all of these entities, and so that we can perhaps direct our students, and the parents can direct their children to these learning channels or the learning channel, so that they can supplement and reinforce what is being done in the classroom. One advice is that there needs to be a timetable, and if there is, that timetable needs to be shared with the schools and with parents.
All right.
Chairman,
yes,
I'd like to interject.
Go ahead.
I think Mr. Motley was referring to students in remote areas who were not served by internet connectivity. Now, you referenced the submission, and you stated that I don't know if you meant it intentionally, but that submission was related to that, what Mr. Motley said. But in the submission itself, it says, for distribution to parents of the selected students. Now, that has nothing to do with students who are in remote areas as referenced by Mr. Motley. So my question would be, how were these students selected? What criteria were they selected? Based on the submission.
Could you repeat the question, Member Naked?
Hello?
Member Naked, could you repeat your question,
yes.
please?
Mr. Motley referenced, yes, Mr. Motley referenced students who were not or did not have access to internet connectivity. And you referenced the submission 5 in the issue papers, where you said, to date, with that collaboration between Ministry of Education, TAT, TSTT, Digicel, you referenced that, and you said that 800 devices would have been delivered to schools for distribution, but you did not mention to parents of the selected students. You referenced that in connection with what Mr. Motley said, as related to students who were in remote areas, not served by connectivity. Am I correct?
Yes, but the submission was from the Education Ministry and not the National Principals Association. So I don't think Mr. Motley will be able to answer that. And
No, it's not a question for Mr. Motley.
I understand your comment.
Yes, you understand my comment. I'm saying that he referenced remote students, but you referenced a submission that relates to parents of selected students after that collaboration. Mm-hmm. There's no link between the two, so I'm still waiting to hear how do we have some kind of connect instead of a disconnect with those students in remote areas. I think Mr. Motley referenced.
I understand your question. So okay. I guess we'll pose that question to the Education Ministry officials.
Exactly.
Thank you, Member Naked.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated earlier, the TAT devices with the connectivity, we are targeting in the first instance our children in exam classes, be they in rural areas or be they in inner city areas where they may be equally disadvantaged. So this is where we are this time. We have since during the lockdown between March and now, we have had discussions with TAT and other service providers trying to get connectivity in those areas where there is none. Part of the agreement with TAT for these devices, it says that we need to do surveys, which we have drafted, and once more of the devices are out there, which we will administer, but it also collects information on connectivity as well. But the service providers, the internet service providers, are well aware of what are the geographic areas that are underserved in terms of connectivity. And we continue to have conversations with them to see how we can ensure that all of our children, as I said, whether in remote districts or otherwise, are served.
Mrs. Carrington James, I'll go to you, and then I'll go to Member Dasing for his issue paper question.
Thank you very much, Chair. The point I wanted to interject here while I raised my hand was that some of our students, especially in the secondary schools of which I can speak, would have not been accessing the online environment, not picking up packages because of the same socio-economical factors that we're talking about. They have gone out to earn an income. So I just wanted to put in there in terms of those who are not coming on, there's a cadre of students, a group of students who we've lost, who I'm sure even when we go back to the building in brick and mortar, it would be a challenge to get them back. The reason for that, of course, is economics. It demands that they go out and work. I feel, though, that if we were a little bit more sensitive to the sterile nature of the platform, that the thrust to simply give students devices would have been supported with a more humane reach out to parents to let them understand the value of the initiative that we are doing. So I just wanted to put that in there, and then to add that there are some stakeholder agencies that have come on board with our schools to give us the support to reach some of these students. In addition to the deans and the SSD, the student support services and so on, we have agencies, and just throughout one, there's a Prince Charles Trust, PTI Trust, that has come in and offered their support through VCTT, the Volunteer Center of Trinidad and Tobago. We've gotten some good stakeholders on board, and I thought I would want to put that out there, that there are some who are assisting us in reaching some of these students who, because of their socioeconomic issues, cannot come onto the platform. And the last comment I would make on this is I heard you, and I heard Senator Naket's attempt to emphasize that this is not just about those children who have received the devices, but I want to take it another step and to suggest that just as there are initiatives to give children and homes and families food cards because we recognize that there are students in the home that need to eat, that it is an onerous responsibility on parents to actually pay for the connectivity that you're talking about supplying. So the data that is needed for some of them, yes, they have connectivity, so to speak, on paper, but they cannot afford that sustained data to support the children online. So just as a food card goes on, maybe there needs to be that means test as well, an assessment of can you afford the connectivity that is available as well.
But I can add to that.
Mr. Chair.
1 second, Member Ford. Before I go to Member Ndasi, because he's been standing by, but one of my concerns is simply this. I'm surprised that the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development would not have data on vulnerable families, particularly in rural areas, because COVID didn't invent those vulnerabilities. COVID exacerbated them. So I'm surprised that we have to do so much testing and surveying. We should by now, I'm presuming, given the mandate of the Education Ministry and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services in various iterations, to use data scans on a national level, because we should have that information about vulnerable families already, because they would have more than likely been vulnerable before the pandemic. To be able to target them in the first, and I'm agreeing with you, to target them in the first instance while we do these scans, as opposed to waiting for a survey to identify them while they continue to miss out. And that is my concern at this stage, that we still, from what we're all saying, are not addressing those vulnerable families who have bread and butter issues that they will tend to first. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food first before education. So I'm surprised we haven't dealt with that situation more effectively. Member Ford and then Member Ndasi.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, again, to follow up with Mrs. Carrington James, the president, Carrington James, that's the name, right, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yes, to follow up on that. In terms of the students that we may be possibly losing, who may now go on to probably employment, or whatever, as she would have mentioned. The thing about it is that I have two daughters, right? They went through the secondary school system, and back then, they had mobile phones. The average secondary school student I think, has a mobile phone, in that it had even reached to the stage where principals had to put measures in place and restrictions in order to, you have to log in your phone on mornings, you cannot go to the classrooms with the telephones and so on. So they may have the devices to do other things, but no devices in order to go on an online education. Priority is one, I think we need to look at. Again, in terms of, the information she gave us, in terms of statistics, any survey, any sort of information that she may need to give, that if they did any little surveys in order to ascertain the numbers, the amount of students, that's one. And then we are also talking about connectivity in rural areas. Again, there is an institution called Ping TT. Presently, they are coming to the Tunapuna constituency in order to go to community centers to set up wireless connection, whereby we want to introduce where persons can come on an evening or during the day, keep their social distancing, whether in the car park, whether inside the building, whether in the surroundings, in order to get it. So again, we may not need to give connectivity to every home in a rural district of Mayaro, Maruga, as the case may be, but we may be able to go to one particular location, a community center, an activity center, set it up, and these people can come socially distanced and participate in connectivity. So I would like her to shed some light there, please.
Chairman, before we go to Rudy. Hello?
Yes, but I'd ask you to stand by Member Naked, because it's a pretty long question, and I don't want the respondent to lose focus on the question. Let the respondent answer first, then I'll come to you.
Okay.
Mrs. Carrington James.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chair again. Member Ford, I had said up front, and maybe it is something, it's not to be ventilated here, for us to look into the role of the Principals Association. It's a volunteer organization. And maybe we need to be seconded and go to CPO and get that kind of a strength, so that we could collect the kind of data that would inform these processes. So a president and a secretary who's on here today, we do not have the resources to collect that data. So do we have any figures? Yes, we do. And I'm saying again, it is anecdotal. What we have that tells us the number, it is somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 12%. What does that say? It is a few schools that we are able to reach. That is a lot of students anyway. If I have a population of 300 children, then 30 children going out to work and with the potential of not returning to school is 30 children too many. The value and the priority put on education is something like I'm saying there must be a softer reach as we give them the hard devices that say we need you online. There must be that shoring up of education is of value as well. Senator,
who gives that? Who sets the priority there, Madam? Who will set the priority there in terms of the student going out to work versus staying at home? Have a device.
Member Ford, first of all, students under 16 cannot go to work. That's illegal. Let's start with that. So let's put that on the table as it's a normal legal thing. So we don't want to be propagating that students going out to work as illegal. Right? Those are anomalies that need to be dealt with. And also you mentioned an issue of average student. I don't know that the target group are average students from average families. They are vulnerable groups that we're discussing in this particular instance. We have to move the conversation along. Member Naked and Member Ndassing, please. Tech, can you unmute Member Naked?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, to Madam Carrington's point. Hello? Hello?
We're hearing you. Go ahead, Member
Naked. Yes. To Madam Carrington's point. Now, there's what we like the ideal and what we like as the reality of Trinidad and Tobago. I think what she referred to, MP Ford, was the actual reality on the ground when it comes to phones. Now, you spoke about principals and so taking phones from the students so that they cannot have access to phones in the school. But you have to remember, in a lot of our societies, especially in the underserved communities, a lot of these students do not have data usage. They do not have a data package. They have their phones primarily for phones for cameras, to have a camera service. So they do not really have that data usage that Madam Carrington is referring to, that they can access online learning. That's one. And two is when you cannot compare a place like Tunapuna, a town like Tunapuna, with remote areas in the south of the country. And so when you talk about somebody coming and putting on and setting up some kind of connectivity for students to come there and have a communal platform. If you go down, if you are familiar with it, you go down to South, you go down to Muruga Tableland, you go down to Claxton Bay and so on, you go into some of these rural communities. Students cannot come to one common area and have that kind of connectivity. So it's like night and day as to what you have suggested. Although it's a good suggestion, it's just not the reality on the ground. And I think that's what was meant by the lack of connectivity, or I think that's what Madam Carrington was referring to. So it might sound ideal, but as a matter of fact, it's ideal, but it's not the reality on the ground, both in terms of data usage and in terms of the actual ability or capacity for our remote students in remote and rural areas to have that access or have that internet connectivity.
Thank you, Member Naked. I'm going to go to Mrs. Henry David and then Mrs. De Freitas and then Member Ndassing for his issue paper question. And we have to move on the conversation because we just have 45 minutes left.
Chair, I just wanted to say that the Ministry of Education has a long-standing relationship with the Ministry of Social Development, whereby students who are on social welfare in the normal scheme of things, they are required to have their paperwork signed off by their respective principals on a termly basis. And in the context of COVID, as early as April, the Ministry of Education would have provided information to the Ministry of Social Development, which would have resulted in the provision of food cards. We understand also that the COVID-19 situation is fluid. So parents who may have been employed in April or in September may now find themselves on the breadline. So we, as it is fluid, we need to continue to collect information in this regard and to continue to collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. De Freitas.
Thank you, Chair. Listening to the questions that have been put this morning and the positions proffered, Tutor wants to suggest, Mr. Chair, and to committee and to the ministry, that what we need to consider is not simply the matter of provision of devices and connectivity and so, but a more macro approach in terms of resilience planning within our education system, whereby we look not only, as I said, at devices, but we look at developing social-emotional learning amongst parents, educators, and students, where we look at training and development of our educators, where we look at, as was suggested, partnering with different agencies, both ministerial and non-ministerial, to treat with issues. Because we are talking here and it appears we are focusing mainly on primary and secondary students. Perhaps we need to also remember, Chair, that we have our ECCE students, our special needs students, and our students at tertiary level who are also caught up in this whole situation and are struggling to various extents. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. De Freitas. Well, just for public information, we're having a second inquiry where we're dealing with the non-national boards, the special needs groups, and also in some instances tertiary level. So they are not left out of our catchment in terms of gleaning information.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I know Dr. Bilzer.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I really, in attempting to move the conversation, I found that the remarks of the president of Tutor is spot on as we go forward. And as we go forward, and I continue to hear points that are being made and information which is coming to us. Before I go to the question that I want to focus on, Chairman, I would like the ministry as they collaborate with the Ministry of Social Development to take on board, because as a member of parliament, I've heard in the past that because you're in a particular household, if a person is getting a grant from the Ministry of Social Development, they are denied accessibility to certain entitlements or benefits that are supposed to be dealt with from a vulnerable point of view. And I hope that in this means test, which has been conceptualized and so on, that if a person or within the family structure is receiving some grant from the Ministry of Social Development, it will not debar a vulnerable child and so on from benefiting from a device under the Adopted School program.
Decision. Let's move on to the issues, please. Issue sheet.
And I would want to ask the ministry officials, have they been engaged, or how they have been focusing on evaluating and assessing the performance of teachers during the first term of what is called the remote teaching environment?
So education and then tutor on that, because I know tutor would want to weigh in on that also. Mrs. De Freitas is already smiling. So education.
Yes. So, Mr. Chairman, as I indicated, we have the systems in place, and the persons within the school system whose duty it is to carry out those assessments of teacher performance, they continue to do their tasks. It's just that it's moved to the online environment.
Well, that is an interesting answer. That, well, the persons who are supposed to do it are doing it. I think the member wanted a little more detail than that.
As I would have indicated previously, we have a draft document where we have been checking and to see what is happening with that. So once we have completed the analysis of the data that we have, we would be willing to share that information with you, with the committee.
Could you give us a sense of the framework of that document, please, so we know, so we get a sense of framework is being used to assess teacher performance? I am sure at this stage you have that.
Okay, so we are at the point where we do not wish to burden schools unnecessarily with constant questionnaires and collection of data. However, we recognize that checks to the system are important, and we need to analyze the data as we go along. So we have been asking schools a number of questions. And some of the questions revolve around the forms of assessment. We looked at the challenges that the schools would have experienced over time. We looked at the packages, and we looked at, among other things, what's happening with the children. We are asking about staff meetings and departmental meetings, and whether the school-based management teams would have met. We are also asking about whether there was professional development in order to address the shortcomings that the teachers may have identified. We're looking at whether the teachers accessed ICT training, for example. And that's basically it that I'm seeing here.
Have there been collaboration with tutor on this modality for assessment of teacher performance?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Don't you think that would have been prudent?
Oh, indeed. We meet with tutor very often, and as you said earlier, I'm sure tutor they're not shy in giving their opinions on issues such as.
But Chairman,
I would prefer or understand that collaboration before public hearings, explanations that would be more constructive. But tutor, go ahead, please.
Chair, thank you. Tutor has advocated that what happened in the physical space pre-COVID should not simply be transposed into the virtual realm. With that in mind, we have suggested that issues such as monitoring and assessment, or monitoring and evaluation, supervision of teachers, is something that would need to be discussed with tutor as a representative majority union based on the nature of those particular processes. I will like to ask our Education and Research Officer to elaborate on the issue of monitoring and supervision of teachers at this time, as took place over the last few months. With your permission.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so Ms. Ibrahim Joseph. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So with regard to the issue of monitoring and evaluation, the process that is recommended by the Ministry of Education and to which tutor in principle has no objection is that of clinical supervision. And clinical supervision is supposed to be a developmental process. It's stated in the ministry's document, and that is what it is. However, historically, and based upon matters with which the association has had to treat with for our members, there has been a punitive mindset in terms of the way in which this process has been managed. And so going forward, we would like to reiterate the position that engaging in clinical supervision as a mechanism for managing and appraising teacher performance has to be a collaborative endeavor between those who are charged with the responsibility of supervising and appraising the teacher and the teacher himself or herself. And it cannot be a process in which the supervising officer simply turns up in the moment. It has to be pre-planned because there are objectives that need to be set and teachers assessed in those, and therefore recommendations for improvement going forward are mutually arrived at by the parties involved. And so we want to advocate that if this is going to be used, then that's a position that must be adopted, but there must be some collaboration between the association and the ministry on how this to be rolled out, particularly in this environment, which we all recognize is fluid. And if we are really honest with ourselves, the members keep referring to the fact that we've been into this 9 months into almost a year. But if we're truly honest with ourselves, a lot of it is being made up as we go along. And we've got to the stage where we have to stop making up. But we have to engage in true and meaningful collaboration, not provide information consultation.
Well, I agree with your last statement about collaboration. I don't like the inference of making it up as we go along, because I don't think that may be fair to the ministry. And yes, everybody is adapting as we go along. So let's kind of keep it civil. Member Ndassing, you have some follow-up questions, and then Member Avinash Singh, please.
Yes, sure. And again, I would like to hear, as it relates from the ministry and any other stakeholder who is willing to make their input. Consideration that very little monitoring can be done for students who receive packages. Is the work that is being returned represents an accurate representation of the student's ability?
Education.
As indicated earlier, there is no real way of getting a true picture with respect to the returned packages. Representatives from the principals associations would have indicated the possibility of parents assisting students with the work that is done. So it is what it is, and this is why we want to ensure that we can move on from those printed packages as best as possible. But we continue to engage those students through those packages in lieu of any other way of reaching them.
Chairman, and could I find out too, and as it relates, as we continue to zero in on this printing of packages, the number of schools that are not outfitted with what we would call high volume printers and copiers and so on?
It's a good question, and what, because my understanding, it has been in the public domain in the media that many principals and teachers have to use their own
resources
to print in some instances.
With respect to high volume, all schools would have printers. As to whether they are high volume, I'm not in a position to indicate. We would, of course, imagine that schools would have some more and some less volume in terms of the amount of printed packages that have to be produced. But I am doubtful that, apart from maybe senior comprehensive schools or so, would have high volume printers. And I would not.
Chair, if I could just
Member Endassing, 1 second, please. Can Mr. Motley comment on that printing issue, and also Mrs. Carrington James?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, indeed. There are a number of our primary schools that are without printers. So let's start there. And also photocopiers, right? And also those schools that have photocopiers, we do not have the funding to maintain them. And one of the things that we require very often for photocopiers is toner. And we did make that point to the Ministry of Education a while now, and we were hoping that by now that the ministry would have provided the schools with printers, photocopiers with toners, but that has yet to be done. The ministry has provided, however, photocopying paper, but as you know, we need ink and we need toner to put the print on the photocopying paper. So we are asking for that to be expedited. We're asking for that to the ministry to do something about that, but we're also asking the ministry to assist those schools in particular do not have photocopiers. And usually there is a correlation between the schools in the very low socioeconomic communities and those schools that don't have photocopiers. So you find that there's a double whammy, so to speak, with respect to the students and the families who are not able to access online, that's on the one hand, and who may have to rely on packages, but because the schools are not all fitted with photocopiers, they too are disadvantaged. So we're hoping that that is addressed soon. Thank you very much.
Let's go to Mr.
Chairman, based on the pronouncements of Mr.
1 second, Mr. Endassing. Just go to Ms. Patricia Pitt and respond to that from the public secondary schools as the secretary.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Is everyone hearing me? Yes, you are? Are you hearing me? Okay, thank you, sir. This discussion concerning packages, it's very important also to the secondary schools, because we have also experienced having packages created at cost, because ink, toner, time, and not being collected as a consequence of parents because of their various economic positions, not being able to come in at the timing that you may have wanted them to come in. So you have hundreds of packages being created, yes, but packages are there at the school, not necessarily in the children's hands. And following that, the ones that are collected, when they are taken home, they are not necessarily brought back in a timely manner. And even if they are brought back, you're not certain as to the fact that it is the child's work, just as everyone has said, because I mean, it was done at home and you don't know who else would have put their thought and their hand into it. So the packages, it has not really been a very successful or effective method to get our children engaged in this learning environment right now. It has not worked very well.
Thank you much for that intervention, Member Endassing, and then Member Avinash Singh.
Very much, Chairman, again, and I hope that based on the pronouncements of Mr. Motley and also Mrs. Pitt, that the Ministry of Education will certainly have the data, because if I listen very correctly, we were told that all schools have photocopiers and printers, and now we are hearing on the contrary. So I hope that the ministry will take the appropriate corrective action based on the pronouncement and to be guided by the data from these stakeholders. And for students who may have been deemed to cover a lower aptitude and so on, and based on the work that is being resubmitted or submitted based on the packages and even on the, from an online point of view, are we, from a ministry's point of view, are you all on board in relation to what corrective action that is being pursued by teachers from a remedial point of view with respect to the students' work?
Mr. Endarsing, I'm a little unclear as to the question. Sorry.
No, I'm talking about in terms of the work that is submitted and the integrity of the work and so on. And based on whatever analysis you all are conducting at the ministry's level and in the compilation of data and so on, are you all working with teachers in your respective schools to see how best they are addressing the issue of remedial work based on the state of play that you all are assessing or the deficiencies?
In terms of student performance, that's what you're talking about?
Yes, in terms of student performance.
In our guidelines that we provided in term 1, we gave support to the teachers in terms of advice as to how to do a diagnostic. We also provided advice specifically for remediating reading. And this is in train with and reiterates what we have been doing by way of initiatives to improve literacy and numeracy. And the curriculum officers have been interacting with schools using virtual meetings, returning emails, and phone calls to be able to both give advice to teachers based on their concerns that they have raised, and secondly, to even examine the packages that have been prepared and give advice in terms of how to continue developing those. We have also engaged them in terms of providing support in relation to how they interpret the curriculum and to students. And that advice that we give looks at students within a range of in terms of a range of achievement levels. This term, having received the results concerning students who are resitting Standard 5 and who have moved on to Form 1 and performed poorly, we have also created, not even created, we are in the process of disseminating materials concerning an adapted curriculum for students of those particular needs. And based on the learning activities that we have developed for primary and secondary, that is well over 1,000 for each level, we have packaged those materials for students. So for instance, materials for English language, let's say for standard, were developed with concepts that were introduced at Standard 1, Standard 2, and Standard 3. We have put those together so that students where there are deficiencies or gaps, the teacher has a resource that they could refer to. So we have also created brochures to give teachers advice on tools that they can access with specific relation to support for the subjects in terms of secondary, and those we are in the process of making available. The links to those resources are already disseminated, and these were resources that were disseminated in term 1. What we are doing is we are uploading and we are populating, and we will continue to provide both communication via online modality, as I said, phones and emails, as well as supporting by providing resources. So within the week, we are expecting to circularize a memo to remind teachers of the resources that we've already provided and to give access to further resources that would support now this targeted group of students in terms of remediation.
Thank you so much. Member Avinash Singh, thank you for your patience. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you, Mr. Chairman, to the Ministry of Education. In going through the submissions, the submission outlines several assessment methods, the hybrid and the blended learning environments, such as face-to-face assessments, remote online learning assessments, and distant learning assessments. My question would be, based on the ministry's preliminary evaluation of the first term of the academic year, which method of assessment proved to be the most challenging for students and or teachers? The second part of that question would be, what were the unique challenges that emerged in attempting to engage special need students during this period of online training and learning? To the Ministry of Education, please.
Thank you, Member Singh.
So the second question had to do with the challenges for the children with special education needs. Right? Correct?
That's correct, yes.
So in terms of special education needs, some of the challenges we have identified would be the need in many cases for a tactile presence for some of these children. The online modality does not work very well for them. They need hands-on. They need to connect with their teachers and their aides and so on a hands-on basis. Some of the other issues that would have arisen would be, as with everybody else, the lack of devices for those who can engage in that modality. We have had instances where the parents who now have to take over the role as the educator, as the main facilitator of education for those children, they have indicated that they have, some struggles with interacting with their children in that capacity. Some of the issues we have had would be the need for training for our teachers in order to engage those students through that modality.
The last time we met in the 11th Parliament, the Director of Student Support Services, which deals directly with students with special needs and students with learning disabilities, identified a resource issue even before the pandemic, and certainly with the pandemic, the need for more funding and also a significant increase in students with behavioral issues, emotional behavioral issues. Has the ministry provided more funding and resources to student support services to deal with these students with special needs?
Mr. Chair, I am not in a position to answer that. I wouldn't want to give an answer that is not correct. My suspicion is that, as with everything else, the budgets of all ministries have seen a reduction rather than an increase. But in terms of specifics, I cannot give specifics. What I can say is that we are attempting, in spite of the financial challenges, we have been, for example, providing training so that the blind welfare would have facilitated training for teachers so that they would be able to engage students in with that particular disability under these current conditions. The student aides have been facilitating, regardless of the fact that they are remote from the students.
What are services telling you in terms of what their needs are and challenges at this time, even in light of the reduced budgetary allocations and resources? Are they, because Mr. Conrad Dennis, I think, I hope,
yes,
Dennis,
yes,
was at wit's end to deal with the load of the students with special needs and behavioral and emotional problems and learning disabilities, because that's the mandate of that division, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so they continue
from the division.
From the division. What they have been telling us is that they've continued to engage students via online modalities, via telephones. Okay. They have hotline numbers out there. And they have been attempting to continue to treat with student issues. They have made videos, for example, that can be sent out to schools. For instance, at SCA time, they would have done the usual sessions that they have with children in preparation for exams. They would have had those recorded so that they could be sent out to the children via virtual mode, and they continue, regardless of the challenges, to put their best foot forward to serve our children.
Do they continue to get an increased number of calls with students with suicidal ideation and behavioral emotional problems because of the stresses of the pandemic?
In terms of increasing numbers, I know that they said they have, not necessarily with suicidal ideation, an average of about 15 calls per day with different issues, and that's why they continue to make themselves available via telephone that people can reach them 24 hours a day, and they continue to engage with the schools and with the parents and students.
Yeah, parent first question.
Which was
I think, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Yeah, which were the challenges and which was the best modality for engaging in terms of the draft study that I have here, I'm not sure if I have information on that at this point in time. We may have to provide that information for you in writing.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair, one more question to the Ministry of Education. In terms of the major challenges experienced in the exam preparation process, I see there's a number of issues that was identified in the submission by the ministry. I just want to know, how does the ministry intend to address the challenges for the upcoming school term and the examinations due in 2021? These submissions could be found on page 22, number 1B. And a follow-up to that question would be, does the ministry intend to alter the curriculum or the curriculum delivery of subjects at the primary and secondary school level to allow for more effective and efficient teaching in the remote hybrid learning system? So can we have some clarification on these issues, please? Thank you.
All right, so with respect to the challenges, one of the challenges was absenteeism, which we continue to treat with through our SSSD, through outreaches by school personnel. In terms of CXC's response, we as all other ministries of education throughout the region are in continual discussion with CXC, trying to bring home to them the peculiar circumstance of our students in Trinidad and Tobago, whereby we have not had face-to-face teaching and learning since last March. And this particular cohort of students would be affected more so than the students who would have sat exams last year. And we continue to impress upon them and to negotiate. I will say, however, that we had the experience last May when we met at a regional level, at the level of the ministers of education, and the strategies for exam, for the administration of exams were put to the vote. It's one territory, one vote, so that while Trinidad and Tobago may have quite a number of students sitting the examination, our vote only counts as one, so that each territory will be in different circumstances at this point in terms of how much teaching and learning their students have been exposed to face-to-face. So therefore, what comes out at the end of this round of discussions, in other words, what the final decision is as to how the exam would be held, when it would be held, what would it comprise of, it may or may not take into consideration the needs of Trinidad and Tobago, because it is representative of the region as opposed to the specific needs of Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of the CXC Moderators app, they would have provided training to persons on how to properly use this application. And we are keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that with respect to the devices and internet connectivity and SBA completion, when our children come out in February, well, as long as the Ministry of Health deems it safe for them to come out, they will be able to complete their SBAs in accordance with what CXC now requires. With respect to the SEA level, we have in fact looked at the composition of those examinations, and there has been a change to the examination framework whereby we have cut back the number of questions in the mathematics and language arts. We have cut back the number of questions, but we have kept the same time frame for students to complain for this year. Yeah, for this year, and for this year we have also circulated the type of essay question that will come. It will be narrative. This information has been on the ministry's website and has been sent out to schools and other stakeholders. And we have also done a specimen paper, which would have been circulated this month, which captures the format that the exam is going to take come June of this year.
All right, before I go, because just some housekeeping, I know we said we'd stop at 12:15 because given that we started at 15 minutes late, and we still have a couple of issues to get through, the Secretariat has advised that I'll be able to go till about 12:45. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we have to leave room in the end for a roundup of comments from the heads of each of the groups represented here. So before I go to Member Naked and his questions, which are coming up next, just as a matter of interest, when we were dealing with the printing of packages, can the ministry identify if some of the issues raised regarding printing of content vis-a-vis copyright infringements have been sorted out by the ministry? Because there's a concern that the ministry may not have paid, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, for common and collective licenses, and teachers who may be copying this content in some instances may open themselves up to some sort of copyright liabilities.
We responded to this matter in two fronts. One, we have prepared learning activities, as I mentioned before, for every level at the primary, every subject at the primary, and forms 1 to 3 at the secondary, with some for CSEC and KEEP. And those are ones that we have assured in terms of quality with respect to using open educational resources. For the teachers, all teachers were invited to be trained by our teacher development unit through an initiative we call on open education resources and how to deal with the matter of copywriting and plagiarism. And they have been advised strongly through these efforts as to what they are permitted to do and how they can source copyright-free resources that are available to them.
Okay, thank you. Member Naked.
Thank you, Chairman Richards. Before I continue with the questions. I think it's very important to stress the reality of the situation. Okay, I've heard a lot of idealism and so, but I'm dealing with the reality. And our reality is such that there are certain children, students in certain demographic areas that are not being served by our education system, especially in this COVID-19.
If I could interject, we covered that area in detail already. I really want to move on because limited time left.
I understand. I understand, but there's a particular point.
We covered it in detail already. Can we move forward, please?
Yes, we can. But there's a particular point that was not answered, and you refer to it as with the packages. The packages imply that these are students that do not have access to online. And MP endorsing us about the lower aptitude after the packages are marked. How do teachers assist these students? And the answer given by the MOE was that there was remedial solutions online. How is that possible? How can we let that pass? This affects students in Success Laventille, and students in Bagatelle, and students in Carenage, and that is of importance to us. That is my point. How can the packages imply that these students do not have a...
Member Naked, could you moderate your tone, please?
Okay. Moderated. Can I have an answer?
Education Ministry, would you like to answer?
The question we were responding to was how we were providing remedial services. To teachers, and support, to teachers so that they could engage in remedial services. The remedial services they provide are through a variety of media, be it print, packages, or online services. And we indicated that our support to the schools are in a variety of ways, and we supported them either through a direct engagement, whether it is in a virtual meeting or through a phone call, whether it is they email information to us and they ask for support. We've provided not just in COVID, prior to that, training on how they can engage in remediation, and they design their packages to be mindful of that. So if the student that they are sending materials to returns responses that suggest that there are concepts that are not, there are gaps in concepts, the concepts are not properly developed, then they would respond accordingly in terms of how they design their future activities and give feedback as well on their packages, if we are speaking specifically to packages. So that is the information I can give in terms of our general responses to support remediation. And if we are looking at a response through print, then teachers are guided and supported to be able to do that. And this is what they are accustomed doing in terms of print in the classroom. They would have given support, corrected children's work. It just would have been real time, not delivered and returned. So it is not that they are not able to do that when they are commonly expected to do feedback and to provide based on their assessment of where gaps are or where deficiencies are, to provide now further activities or items of work or mini lessons to be able to help the children in terms of review the concept or deepen their learning.
Thank you.
Thanks for a little more clarity.
And thanks so much.
My question is, your submission indicated that regards to special considerations given to support students enrolled in schools that are under academic watch or classified as underperforming, the MOE has provided schools with an adapted curriculum in subjects offered in Form 1 and 2. The adapted curriculum is implemented as required. That's from the MOE submission, page 21, number 3. First question, what does the adapted curriculum entail? MOE?
The adapted curriculum provides a different scope in terms of the breadth and depth of what should be covered for a child who is, let's say, performing at under 30%. And we have, in the case of mathematics and English language arts, students who are between 0 and 10%. So we would have advice on core skills, foundation skills that should be covered, deepened, the learning deepened. We would have provided some recommendations on resources as well as strategies. Training would have been provided to support how those students are to be taught using differentiated instructions, manipulators, hands-on approaches, or other forms of pedagogy. This was done prior to COVID. So what we have done is we have re-disseminated, and in our interactions with the school, we have continued our work in terms of, but we've taken it to some extent, well, not to some extent, in all cases, to the virtual landscape. And we have used, as I said, supported with emails, phone calls, and so on, because we are not at the school on a face-to-face basis. The teachers are not always at the compound as well, given ministry's guidelines. So this program to support students is not one that has been developed for the COVID period. It's one that has been in train and that we've continued, and we have increased our support by now providing learning activities, and these highlight the concept. You have then a developmental activity for the child to be able to interact with the concept, and then there's a small assessment activity, and all the responses, the answers, so to speak, are provided in the learning activity. And these are packaged and shared using an online link to the schools so that the teachers have access to support materials. And the compilation is in such a way that as we provide more resources, schools can access them through the same link.
Well, in light of what you just said, how many schools, do you have data to how many schools are currently implementing this adapted curriculum?
In terms of the
adapted curriculum that you spoke to, right. How many schools are?
So it would be, all right, the information is made available to all schools, but the schools that are targeted are schools who would have received a significant percentage of population of students that scored under 30% at the formal level, and that number is around 56 schools. Secondary schools, I'm speaking.
Secondary schools.
So we're not talking about schools that have an occasional student who they receive with a low performance. We're talking about a significant population of students after the SCA were assigned or placed.
Remember, I can put a pause there. I'd just like to invite, if I could, Ms. Paula Kalakan. We haven't heard from you the entire interface, and we're drawing to a close in terms of how the primary school principals responded to this adapted curriculum. If I could be so bold, Mr. Motley, and engage your colleague. Can you unmute your mic, please, Ms. Kaltman?
Good day.
Good day.
The primary school principals and teachers, we have tried our best to adapt to the best of our ability. I must say that it is a challenge being online, but we are working along with our teachers, and we must give credit to teachers for being creative and innovative and sourcing material online to assist in the delivery of the curriculum. It is a challenge, and we still have those students that are unreachable. But we find teachers going beyond the call of duty and using WhatsApp calls, video conferencing, sending videos of themselves, giving demonstrations to try to facilitate to reach particularly those parents and students receiving the packages. So we are adapting and trying to cope as best as we can. And we will continue to strive to reach all in the delivery of the curriculum.
Madam, I too, like you, do commend our teachers and enough respect for their efforts. But do we have any idea to the Ministry of Education, the adapted curriculum was schools that you targeted? Do you have any data as to if they were effectively implemented the adapted curriculum during this COVID period? Not before, but during the COVID period?
Mr. Naked, not specifically at this time. The children would have come into school in October for the most part, but those in Form 1, so it's been short time for that sort of assessment.
But things are being put in place to get that information, get that data, which would be important to know where we are.
Yes, and to see whether it's effective as well.
Member Naka, we have time for one more question before we start the round of our comments from our stakeholders.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you, Chair. And how did this remote learning methods affect the implementation of this adapted curriculum? Do you have any idea? It must have been challenging. Ministry of Education?
So when you think of the target in terms of students who scored under 30%, the similar parameters in terms of those who are dropping out, who are not accessing or able to be reached, those who are not able to be engaged with in terms of not having services or devices apply. The correlation is there so that we know that the dice is a little bit loaded in this case. We have provided an opportunity to assist the teachers because we recognize that these children cannot engage in the full curriculum at the point of entry into secondary school, Form 1 specifically, and that is why the effort to give them support in terms of adaptation was initiated. Don't know that.
If I may add.
Is there something you wanted to add?
Yes, this is an ongoing process, so that it will be difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of this new adaptable timetabling program for the below 30% achievers. It's an ongoing process, and we will have to keep working with them, and we will see the effect in the long term, not in the short term.
Just before I call for the heads of the organizations to provide a quick wrap-up, to the Education Ministry officials, has there been an assessment of schools or districts that are underperforming under COVID restrictions and with a sense to seeing what the remedial action can be in terms of resources directed to those schools and or educational districts?
Yes, so we, as I said, are in the process of collecting that data. We have all along been collecting data and looking at, for instance, we've looked at attendance, we've looked at whether the packages have or have not been collected. And our current round of information collecting or rather analysis deals a little bit more specifically with what has been happening in the classroom. In terms of remedial efforts, once we have done the analysis, we'll have to provide the remedies that best suit the issues. But all of our data is analyzed at a district basis. So for example, when we look at the data, we see that some of the remote districts are the ones, as we would have suspected, where we have the most challenges. So we recognize, therefore, that more effort has to be put into ensuring that they are resourced in those districts so that everyone can be, well, hopefully at the same level.
Thank you. Just before we go to the roundup, I just want to precede some of the submissions received from members of the public. This one from Abaluk, submitted January 14th. She, as a mother, says that she's heard the cries of several persons within the community as relates to the lackluster teaching performance, but online learning has worked very well for her child. And she knows other areas need to be strengthened, but it's not all bad. And I've done quite a bit of paraphrasing there. From Avian McLeish, submitted December 18th. This has failed with respect to remedial and special education students. Students were slow in doing simple activities in school and are now slow in learning how to manipulate devices. A new strategy will have to be implemented to teach and slowly introducing online skills to help students who are underperforming, aware of the technicalities in using devices. Not all students are awkward with devices. And also from Sparkle Martin, submitted on January 19th, to whom it may concern. My name is Sparkle Martin, and my daughter attends Newtown Girls, and her daughter is doing much better. The online school has worked better out for her. She normally moved at her own pace in class. She's always said Mrs. moving too fast. And now in Google Classroom, she can go back to the recordings and revise for herself. So it's not all bad news. I mean, different students have different aptitudes and stuff. So just wanted to give some of the feedback from some of the submissions we received from private citizens. Let's go through the round. Mrs. Henry David, your closing comments, please.
Well, Chairman, I want to thank you all for this opportunity for us to come here and speak to what the ministry has been doing. I just want to say that we recognize as we go forward that we need to continue to collaborate with all of our stakeholders, and that's the only way that we can ensure that we meet the needs of all our students. We have to meet the needs where they are. We recognize that some of our students are at a greater disadvantage than others during these times, and we know that we have to continue to work together and to adapt to suit the needs of those children and to marshal all of our resources in order to ensure that we come out of this system in a place that we can be proud of, and knowing that we have done our utmost best to treat the needs of all of our students. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much. And we know that you were the recipient of most of the focus today, but so we thank you for your patience and contribution. Miss Antonia Taker de Freitas from Tutor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Tutor wishes to thank the committee for the opportunity to participate today. We want to assure the committee and the public that we are committed to ensuring the welfare of our students as we seek to promote the cause of education. We stand ready to work together with all to build resilience into our education system and to assure that we will offer our recommendations along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mrs. Shira Carrington-James from the Association of Principals of Public Secondary Schools.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the entire committee for allowing the Association of Principals to be part of this interaction. And to add clarity, we hope that as we go forward, our submissions would lend to us moving from this fixed mindset into one of growth, and that we would hopefully have contributed to an actionable blueprint to move forward. I'm going to just take one little, having said that, and thanked you graciously, I had hoped we would have gotten to the gaps. We have not, so I hope in the submission you would pay attention to the gaps, because we in the principalship feel that though the policies are there, just moving it online has not worked efficiently all around. I'm going to give you one little example. How does a teacher apply for leave? Does a teacher take leave if he or she is at home in his or her house? And that is going on. That is something to work out maybe with our union, and how that policy of application for leave is actually. So I say thank you very much. Thank you for the support, the interest, and we look forward to further involvement of our association.
Thank you so much. And as you raised that point, there's nothing, we welcome your further submissions in writing based on our discussions today that we can factor into our final report. So thank you for that. And Mr. Motley from the National Primary Schools Principals Association.
Mr. Chairman, NAPSA wishes to thank you for the opportunity to be able to have a voice here today. On leaving, we would want to say that while the pandemic would have widened the gaps between the haves and the have-not, we want to urge the powers that be to take the necessary steps to accelerate the efforts to ensure that the gaps are not so wide that it will take a number of years or a long time for them to be narrowed again. Otherwise, we're going to end up with some serious situations in our country. So I want to call on the government to please resource the Ministry of Education with all that it needs so that it can be able to ensure that all of our nation's children have equal access to education.
Equitable access.
Equitable access.
All right. Thank you all so much for your participation today and your prior submissions. Once again, you can feel free, based on our discussions today, to submit further submissions to the Secretariat. We will welcome those and factor them into our final report moving forward. I'd also like to thank members of the committee, Member Ford, Member Monroe, Member Indarsing, Member Singh and Member Naked, and Members Beckles and Sinan in the absentia. They had a conflicting engagement with Cabinet, I understand. Members of the Secretariat, led by the erstwhile Mr. Julian Ogilvie, who always provide amazing support to the committee, and of course the persons who submitted privately and to the Secretariat and the viewers and listeners to this broadcast. Paul Richards, the chairman, we thank you for viewing and listening, and we wish you a safe and enjoyable evening. Thank you so much. We are now adjourned.